The sun beat down like judgment from the heavens, and the dust clung to Clara Washaki's throat like shame. She stood on the wooden platform in the center of Iron Creek's main street, her younger brother Samson pressed against her side, clutching a fistful of her skirt, with fingers too small and too tight. Around them, men shouted numbers like she was a mule with clean teeth, or a cow fit for calving. $25, $35 for the girl and the boy. $40. Sam's face was buried in her hip. His body was shaking, but he didn't make a sound. Clara didn't move, didn't flinch. If she showed weakness, they'd smell it like wolves. Her heart might be splitting in her chest, but she kept her chin high. She stared past the heads of the crowd to the foothills beyond the town. Somewhere out there, the wind ran wild. Somewhere no one called little boys extra mouths or girls merchandise. Strong back, clean hands, the auctioneer called out, his voice slick as oil and twice as foul. Knows how to cook and mend. Brother's healthy, only 5 years old, he'll be hauling water in no time. Gentlemen, you're bidding on quality frontier stock. The word burned worse than the sun. Stock. Like she wasn't a daughter or a sister or a person at all. The bidding dragged on. Laughter rose like flies over something rotting. Men licked their lips and nodded to the auctioneer with flicks of their chins, a few throwing glances her way that turned her stomach. One of them, the red-faced shopkeeper Brennan had sold her father chewing tobacco once with a smile. Now he was offering $35 for Clara and Samson like they were a pair of boots. Don't cry. Don't cry. Last night she'd whispered to Sam in the dark corner of the boarding house room they were being evicted from. I'll keep you safe. I'll find a way. Just stay close to me, little brother. And he had all morning without complaint. He hadn't even asked for bread. When she gave him the last crust, just chewed and nodded like a grown man. 45, someone hollered. Laughter rippled again. She'll earn it back in a month. Clara closed her eyes just for a second. She didn't pray. Not because she didn't believe, she just didn't think heaven was listening anymore. 50. She opened her eyes. The bidder was swaying, liquor on his breath. Dirty hat clutched in one hand, belt unbuckled. Clara's stomach turned cold. The auctioneer grinned. Now we're getting somewhere. Gentleman Sam's grip on her skirt tightened. His face was hot against her side, but he still didn't cry. The hammer lifted. Going once 100. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Low, unhurried, like it wasn't afraid of being heard. Every head turned. Clara turned too, her breath caught in her throat. He stood apart, lean, weathered. The brim of his hat threw his face into shadow, but his stance was carved from stone. His shirt was dust-faded blue sleeves rolled to the forearms, boots scuffed and sun-battered. He didn't step forward, didn't push, just stood there, one gloved hand resting casually on his belt. His voice carried like a rifle crack through the stunned silence. Cash. Right now. The auctioneer faltered, blinking. Well now, that's a serious bid, folks. $100 for the girl and the boy going once. Clara couldn't breathe. The stranger's eyes met hers. Slate gray, clear, no hunger, no cruelty. Just something quiet, something still. Going twice. She didn't look away. Sold to Mr. Red Elk, Mr. Boone, Red Elk. The gavel came down with a slap that echoed off the buildings like a gunshot. Clara didn't move. The heat, the dust, the noise, all of it had gone quiet in her head. Sam looked up. Is it over? He whispered. Clara didn't answer. She just wrapped her arm around his shoulders and held him tight. Boone Red Elk moved forward, nodding once to the auctioneer, handing over the cash with a calm hand. She watched him sign the papers in the land office like he was ordering supplies. She stood in the corner with Sam while the ink dried. The auctioneer chuckled. You'll get your money's worth, Mr. Red Elk. Strong girl, steady hands. You'll break her in easy. Boone didn't reply. He folded the receipt, tucked it in his pocket, and turned toward her. You two eaten today, Clara blinked. What food? You had breakfast, no, she said before she could stop herself. He nodded. Come on. He turned toward the door. Sam looked up at her. Clara hesitated. The words owned and sold echoed in her ears, but Boone Red Elk hadn't touched her, hadn't leered. He just asked if they'd eaten. She took Sam's hand and followed. The town stared as they passed. She heard a woman murmur behind a parasol. A man snorted into his beer. The whole of Iron Creek turned to watch Boone Red Elk lead a bought girl and her brother to breakfast, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The restaurant was clean but quiet, smelled of bacon and biscuits. The woman behind the counter gave Boone a look. He didn't flinch. 3 plates, eggs, bacon, potatoes, pie if you've got it, coffee, milk for the boy. He dropped coins on the counter like nails into wood. The woman stared, then moved toward the kitchen without a word. Boone motioned them to a corner table. Clara lowered herself onto the bench, stiff-backed. Sam slid beside her, wide-eyed and quiet. Boone sat across from them, sipping coffee. I have a ranch about 2 hours northwest, he said without preamble. You'll work. I'll pay. You'll have your own space. After a month, you can leave if you want. Clara stared. Why did you buy us? His eyes held steady. Because someone needed to, and I could. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. She wanted to demand more, but her hands were shaking. Sam leaned into her side. Her heart thudded. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But he hadn't grabbed her. He hadn't asked anything of her. He'd fed her. That was more than anyone else had done since her father died in the fever. The plates arrived heavy with food. Sam's eyes went wide. Clara tried not to stare at her own. Bacon, biscuits, gravy, real eggs. Eat, Boone said. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Clara Washakie did. She didn't speak again until her plate was clean. Boone watched the street through the window, his coffee half gone. Not once did his gaze stray to her neckline or her hands. Not once did he ask for thanks. I don't keep people, he said finally, voice low. I fix fences, I break horses, I don't break women. Clara's eyes burned. She wouldn't let herself cry. She looked at Sam, then back at Boone. 1 month. Boone nodded once. Then we'll see. Outside, clouds began to gather, drifting in from the north, dark and heavy. The wind shifted. Iron Creek whispered behind them, and the wagon waited at the edge of the street, already half-packed. I don't care if you got a name or not. Out here you've got a chance, but you gotta want it. She didn't know how long she'd been walking. Her legs burned, her bare feet split from gravel and dry thorns. The little boy in her arms had stopped crying a while ago. His small face rested against her shoulder, red from sun and dirt, his breath shallow. With every step, her knees buckled beneath his weight. But she kept going. For him. The Texas sun was no longer golden. It turned white-hot when they left the river, and the scrubland shimmered ahead like the land itself was boiling. Sagebrush, sun-bleached cattle bones, and nothing else. She'd lost the road, if she'd ever been on it. They hadn't meant to escape. Not exactly. The wagon master's girl had fallen asleep, and the man selling them had been too drunk to notice her slip away. She hadn't planned it. Just saw a sliver of moonlight hit a gap in the fence and walked through it. For hours, maybe days. Now her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. Her dress was torn, The wind slapped it against her legs. Every buzz of a fly felt louder. She blinked toward the horizon and saw a line. A fence, maybe. A corral. Then a shape. A house. Barn. Or just her mind breaking. She staggered forward, muttering under her breath, "Just a little more, Micah. Just a little more." He didn't stir. She reached the split-rail fence and clutched it, dizzy, half-blind. The boards were smooth and warm. Real. She looked up, and a figure stepped from the barn. Tall. Broad. Hat shadowing his face. A rifle slung against his side. For a second, terror seized her again. Maybe she'd only run from one cage into another. But he didn't move. The man, dark-haired, lean-weathered, watched her. Not like a buyer. Not like those men back at the rail yard. He looked at her like she was something he'd never expected to see. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her knees gave out. She sank to the ground, shielding Micah's head as they hit dirt. Her vision tunneled. Black spots swirled like ink in water. Then boots, dust, a voice rough like dry timber. "Ma'am," she flinched. The cowboy kneeled beside her. Not too close. One hand near his belt, not on the rifle. "Don't touch my brother," she rasped. "He didn't. He all right." Her arms tightened around Micah. No water. The man shifted, pulled a canteen from his side and unscrewed it. Held it out without a word. She hesitated, then took it and lifted it to Micah's mouth first. His lips barely moved. She drank next, choking on the metallic tang of old tin and life. The water dripped down her chin and darkened her dress, and she didn't care. "You hurt?" he asked. She didn't answer. "You got a name?" Silence. He nodded slowly, like he expected that. "I'm Colt Reeves." She looked up. "I've got cattle, a few goats, barns mostly sound. House is too big for one man. Was gonna fix it up this fall." "You hungry?" Her eyes narrowed. He stood. "Don't matter what you did or where you came from. Only matters where your feet are now. And you're standing on my land." She gripped the ground like it would vanish. "We don't got nowhere else." Colt looked at her, then past her to the path she came from, to the dry wind pushing grit across the prairie. "Then stay," he said. "For now." She blinked. He bent down, lifted Micah gently from her arms. "You can walk?" She nodded, shaky, and followed him through the fence line. The house rose from the earth, like a memory of something finer. The white paint had long since peeled away, and the porch sagged a little on one side, but the roof held. The windows blinked in the fading sun. Inside it smelled of cedar and dust. Colt laid Micah on a quilted couch and opened the window. The breeze lifted the curtains like breath. He disappeared into the kitchen boots, echoing on worn pine. She stayed frozen by the door. "You don't trust me," he said, voice floating back. She didn't reply. "That's all right. Trust ain't something I ask for. It's something you'll give or not." She stepped forward slowly, eyes on her brother. Colt returned with a chipped bowl of beans, cornbread, and a slice of smoked ham. Set it on the table, then stepped back. "Eat slow." She moved to the table, sat, and ate with small bites, every muscle ready to bolt. The food tasted better than anything she remembered. Not because it was fine, because it was hers for once, and no one watching her chew like she owed them something. "Your brother's too young to go long without water," Colt said. "He'll need broth, salt, sleep." She nodded. He studied her. "How old are you?" She paused. 16, maybe 17. "You don't know, don't remember." He let that sit. "You got a name." She hesitated. Her real name belonged to people who sold her. Her old name had been used like a handle on a bucket. Something to pull drag beat. She didn't want it anymore. I'll call you Willa Colt, said gently, if that's all right. She stared at him. Willa was my mother's name. Strong woman. Died giving birth to my sister. His voice dropped. She didn't make it either. Something cracked in her chest. Not pain, not trust. Something deeper recognition. Willa, she whispered. He nodded once. Good. Now rest. Tomorrow we figure what's next. That night, Willa sat by Micah's side watching his chest rise and fall. Her hands finally still. Her stomach full. Her back not curled against a wall. And in that space between exhaustion and thought, she whispered the name like a prayer. The wind shifted. The coyotes were quiet. In the hallway, Colt leaned against the wall, arms folded. He'd seen things on ranches he never talked about. The way a calf tried to stand too early. The way a mare cried when her foal was taken. He'd seen girls like her at auctions. Boys like Micah on the side of wagons hungry. But never had he seen someone fight so hard to stay alive without making a sound. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Morning would come fast, and they weren't safe yet. I don't trust smiles that come after cruelty, I whispered to myself, watching the woman approach, apron clean, but her eyes far from kind. The door creaked as Ruth entered the modest farmhouse. Her arms tightened around Jamie instinctively, as though some part of her already sensed the shift in air, something too still, too careful. The woman who stood by the stove smiled like someone posing for a painting. Sunlight caught on her spectacles, making her unreadable. Her name was Edna, and she wore neat braids coiled at the back of her head like a crown of control. She nodded once, but said nothing to Ruth at first, just looked her over. Jamie began to fuss, but Ruth bounced him gently, whispering into his ear. That's the baby, Edna finally said, as if confirming a rumor. Ruth answered with a single nod, her voice caught in her throat. Set him down in the crib. It's in the room past the hall. I'll show you later. You'll take your meals after you finish cleaning. She wasn't asked if she was hungry. She wasn't asked her name. The cowboy had handed them off with the words, "Someone safe," but Ruth was already learning that safety could be a relative term. Edna handed her a rag and a bucket. Start with the front room. Floors need scrubbing. Ruth blinked, not in defiance, but in disbelief. Her legs ached from the ride, her ribs still sore from the cart crash 2 days prior. She hadn't been able to eat more than a few bites of cornbread and a sip of broth at the ranch. And now she was here, ordered into motion, with the same chill voice her mother used before the belt came out. I'll do it, Ruth said quietly. The floors were wood-wide, planked and dry, but she scrubbed them with a thoroughness that made her fingers raw. As she worked, she tried to hear Jamie in the crib down the hall, tried to match each of his soft sounds with a rhythm of reassurance in her chest. He didn't cry much. That worried her more than if he had. By evening, Ruth's knees were aching. Edna set a plate down on the table without looking at her. Eat there, she said. No babies at the table. Ruth's mouth opened, but no words came. She stared at the stew, thick, dark, and heavy with salt. It didn't smell like comfort. It smelled like a warning. Jamie cried just then from the other room. Ruth stood to go to him, but Edna's hand shot out, quick, firm, bony fingers around her wrist. You eat first. I'll eat later. He needs you eat now. Or not at all. Ruth's heart beat painfully against her ribs. She pulled her wrist back slowly, the imprint of Edna's grip already fading. Without a word, she left the table and picked up Jamie. He was damp, his diaper soaked through his skin, pink with the start of a rash. There were no extra cloths in the room. Ruth improvised with one of her underskirts. It made Edna scowl, but she didn't speak. The nights were worse. Edna didn't like crying. She didn't like noise. She didn't like mistakes. Each night, Ruth would feed Jamie in the small back room, rocking him with tears drying on her cheeks. Not from grief, but from a gnawing question that wouldn't stop digging inside her. Was this really safety, or just a new kind of cage? 3 days passed. Ruth did everything she was told. Chopped wood, washed laundry, peeled potatoes until her hands were blistered. She said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, never raised her voice and didn't smile too wide when Jamie laughed for the first time that week. But it wasn't enough. On the 4th day, Ruth came in from hauling water to find Jamie's cradle empty. She dropped the pail water splashing across the wooden floor like spilled fear. Jamie, her voice cracked. In the pantry, Edna called from the kitchen too casually. He wouldn't stop fussing, so I put him somewhere quiet. Ruth bolted across the house, yanked open the pantry door. Jamie lay in a wooden apple crate, a rough wool blanket beneath him. His cheeks were flushed, his little fists curled. A single apple sat beside him, as though someone had mistaken him for part of the harvest. Ruth scooped him up. Her voice shook. "He's a baby, not a broom you store in a corner." Edna didn't flinch. He needed dark and quiet. Ruth's voice rose without her meaning it to. He needed his mother. Silence. Edna's eyes narrowed behind the glasses. "You got something to say, girl?" Ruth stared at her, holding Jamie tight. The silence stretched. It was the same kind of silence her stepfather used before he threw something, before the punishment came. But Ruth didn't shrink. Not this time. "Yes," she said, voice low and tight. "I do." But she didn't say it. She turned and walked out of the pantry, back to the bedroom. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. That night she lay awake in bed, Jamie sleeping against her shoulder. His breath warm, his hand on her chest. She whispered to him, "We're not staying. I won't let you grow up in this. I promised you. I promised Mama." Ruth waited until the rooster crowed the next morning. She made breakfast. She folded laundry. She peeled potatoes with the same quiet determination. Then she packed a small bag. 1 bottle, 2 cloths, half a loaf of bread, and the coin, the silver dollar the cowboy had slipped into her hand when Edna wasn't looking. Just in case he'd said like he'd known something. She tucked Jamie against her chest, wrapped snug in a sling she'd fashioned from a flour sack. Then she stepped outside. The wind was cold and dry. The sun was high but not warm. Ruth began to walk, not back toward the hills, not toward town, toward the ranch, toward the man who'd looked her in the eyes and said, "You're safe now." Because safe wasn't a word, it was an action, and it was time to see if he meant it. The road stretched long and empty ahead. Dust clung to her boots. Jamie stirred, nuzzled closer, and settled back to sleep. Behind her, the farmhouse sat still. Ruth didn't look back. She had no space left for backward things, only forward, only what might come next. And she prayed the man with the storm-colored eyes was still waiting. Because if not, she didn't know what came after hope ran out, but she was going to find out. She walked faster. She was only ever given choices that led her to hunger, until he gave her one that led to dignity. The wind was pushing against the boards of the bunkhouse when Cora opened the door. The fire inside had burned low, casting a dull orange hue across the floor. One of Ruth's old shoes sat beside the stove, tipped over like she'd kicked it off in a rush. Cora picked it up, cradling it in her calloused palm, as if it held the weight of everything she still didn't understand. Behind her, the snowstorm had finally given way to a soft hush. It was morning, but the light was dim, filtered through the heavy gray of winter clouds. She hadn't slept, not really. She dozed a bit on a pallet beside the twins, waking every hour to feel their foreheads and make sure their chests still rose and fell. She didn't trust sleep. Not anymore. Ruth stirred beneath the quilt, murmuring something in her sleep. Cora walked over and knelt beside her, tucking the blanket higher. A strand of Ruth's dark hair clung to her cheek, and in that moment she looked less like a child and more like a woman who had been fighting for too long. Down at the big house, the cook stove must have started up again. Smoke curled from the chimney and drifted sideways in the breeze. She hadn't seen the rancher since he left them with blankets and the promise of food. There was a look in his eyes that stuck with her. Not pity, not charity. It was something harder to name, something that made her feel as though her life wasn't invisible after all. By the time she reached the kitchen door of the big house, her fingers were numb again. It opened before she could knock. "You come in here on them bare feet again, you're getting a slipper to the backside," came a voice sharp as pine needles. It belonged to Laney, the ranch cook, broad-shouldered and faster with a spoon than most men with a whip. Cora stumbled in the scent of biscuits and ham, slapping her square in the stomach. Her knees weakened. "I was gonna ask, if you don't ask, you sit," Laney barked. "Don't matter if you're poor or proud. Storm like that, you eat." Cora sat. A moment later, a plate landed in front of her, steam rising from hot potatoes and eggs. She barely got a thank you out before the first bite made her cry. She didn't mean to. She kept chewing like nothing was wrong, but the tears came anyway, fat and silent. "You cry into my grits, and I'll charge you double," Laney muttered, not unkindly. "Eat, girl. No shame in being hungry." Cora swallowed the lump in her throat, along with the last of the potatoes. "What does he want from us?" she asked, finally looking up. "The rancher. He took us in, fed us, gave us blankets. He don't know us." Laney wiped her hands on her apron and sat opposite her. "That man's seen enough winter to know when somebody needs help. That's all. But folks don't do that. Not without asking something back." "He ain't folks," Laney said. "He's William Taggart." The name didn't mean much to her, but the way Laney said it made her pause, as if the name alone carried weight heavier than gold. Later that afternoon, she was back in the bunkhouse feeding warm broth to Ruth when the door creaked open. William stood in the framed snow on his shoulders, a burlap sack in one hand. "I brought some things," he said. She stood quickly, brushing her skirt down. "Sir, thank you for all you've done. We'll find a way to pay you back." He walked in and set the bag down. "That's not why I'm here." Ruth blinked awake, staring at him like she didn't trust he was real. William took a slow step toward her, then knelt. "I was raised by a woman who took in strays, wild horses, wild boys, a few sick chickens. She didn't keep score. Said people who kept ledgers in their hearts always ended up lonely." His voice was calm, but something flickered beneath it. Something old. "This ain't about debt." Cora looked down. "You gave us more than we ever had." "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he replied quietly. She glanced up, startled. "Sir, I need help on the ranch. Real help. My foreman left 2 weeks ago, and spring work won't wait. You've got hands, grit, and good sense. You and your sister can stay in the bunkhouse. I'll pay you fair, feed you both. No charity. A choice." Cora stared at him, heart-thudding. She hadn't had a real choice in years. Not since their father vanished and the cousins pawned everything down to their mother's wedding band. Every path since then had led to hunger. A choice, she whispered. "Yes." She turned to Ruth, who gave a tiny nod. Her sister's cheeks still held the faint hollows of starvation, but her eyes were steady. "All right," Cora said. "We'll stay." William stood, gave her one last look, then headed for the door. Work starts before dawn, he said over his shoulder. Laney'll show you what's what. That night, as Cora swept the bunkhouse floor and Ruth hummed something soft near the stove, the world didn't feel quite so heavy. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, leaving everything coated in a quiet white stillness. A new stillness. Not like before when silence was filled with fear and hunger. This silence held space, possibility. She sat by the fire brushing Ruth's hair in long strokes. The old comb they'd carried from their mama's chest felt almost holy in her hand. For the first time in weeks, Ruth wasn't shivering. You think we can really do this? Ruth asked quietly. Cora thought of William's eyes, the way he looked at her like she was worth more than worn-out shoes and ragged coats. I think we already are. They slept soundly that night, the kind of sleep that mends what the world tried to tear. But just before dawn, Cora woke to a sound. Hooves. Fast ones. Then the slam of a gate and a shout. Not William. Not Laney. Men she didn't recognize. She pulled Ruth close and slid the latch across the door. Her breath caught as she pressed her ear to the cold wood. They weren't alone on the ranch anymore, and some shadows didn't stay buried in snow. She was trying to build a home, and they were already digging its grave. The wind kicked up dust along the path as Ruth stood outside the cabin, arms wrapped tight around her middle. The hammer in her hand hung low forgotten, while a bent nail jutted stubbornly from the corner beam she had tried to fasten. Morning sun poured over the hills, but it did nothing to warm her chest. A sound behind her made her turn Sarah barefoot in the frost-bitten grass, holding a handful of eggs in her apron, eyes too wide for a child her age. I found 3, she whispered, proud and shivering. Ruth knelt and drew her close. That's enough for breakfast. We'll save one for supper. They cooked in silence. Matthew had left before sunup, heading to the town 2 valleys over to speak to a man about hauling lumber. The man was no friend, but he had a wagon and a mule, and sometimes that was enough to make do. Ruth stayed behind with Sarah, who didn't speak much anymore unless asked. By noon, the 2 of them had managed to tack up half the new roof slats Matthew had milled. Ruth climbed up carefully, each board creaking beneath her as she nailed down the weathered cedar. Sarah passed the nails up from below in a rusted tin. They worked like that until clouds began to roll in from the north. Then came the riders. At first she thought it was thunder, but the pattern was too steady. 4 horses, maybe 5. Ruth squinted and spotted them cresting the ridge men she didn't recognize, moving like they had a reason. She called down to Sarah to go inside and not open the door unless it was her voice calling. Then she climbed down and waited at the edge of the field. Fingers still aching from the hammer jaw locked tight. The first man dismounted before the others. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face, and a long coat too clean for a man from this side of the mountain. He tipped his chin, but didn't smile. Mrs. Vance, I'm Ruth, she said, not confirming anything. Name's Elias Crocker. I represent the Hastings Timber Company. We've been acquiring plots along this slope. You may have heard. I've heard, she said evenly. We own every parcel from Iron Ridge to Widow's Peak, he said, glancing at the hills behind her. Except yours. I've got the deed in a lockbox and the survey markers haven't moved. His jaw twitched. We're prepared to offer a fair price. Cash. The company intends to run a mill and your land's the last hinge. Ruth looked past him at the other men. None of them spoke, just sat on their horses' hands resting too close to their holsters. She turned her gaze back to Crocker. This land belonged to my husband's father. It's where he was born. We're not selling. Crocker's mouth bent into something like a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ma'am, I understand how sentiment works, but we're not sentimental. We're practical. You can take the money or take what's left after the trees are felled and the road runs through your front porch." She stepped forward, her voice like a drawn wire. "Then you'd better pack lunch for a long siege, Mr. Crocker, because I've fought harder men than you just to survive a winter." Crocker studied her, then chuckled. "We'll be in touch." They turned without another word, dust kicking up again behind their horses as they rode out. Ruth watched until they disappeared over the ridge. When she stepped back inside, Sarah stood behind the door, clutching the doorknob like it was her lifeline. "Are we safe?" the girl whispered. "For now," Ruth murmured, kneeling to hold her, "but we'll have to get stronger." Matthew came back that evening, shoulders tight and eyes shadowed. Ruth didn't speak of the riders until Sarah was asleep on the cot by the stove. "They came from Hastings Timber," she said, keeping her voice low. "Said they want the land. I told them to take a hike." Matthew's hand clenched on the table. "I heard rumors in town. They've been leaning on folks tearing up their fences, even torching cabins after dark. You believe it? I've seen the ashes." Ruth leaned back, feeling the walls around them tighten. "Then we don't have long." Matthew's gaze drifted to the window. "They want us afraid. That's how they move in, one step at a time. Then we stand together." He nodded. "But we'll need help." She thought of Eli Talbot, their nearest neighbor 5 miles up the hill. Old as tree bark, but still sharp. He'd once fought off claim jumpers in the copper rush and was known to have a few rifles stashed behind his flour barrel. If anyone would stand with them, it'd be him. "I'll ride to Eli in the morning," Matthew said. "You stay with Sarah." But the next day brought more than just the plan. When Ruth went out to feed the chickens, she found the coop doors ripped open. The hens were gone, feathers scattered like a warning across the yard. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just gathered the feathers one by one and burned them in the stove. Matthew left after breakfast, rifle strapped to his back jaw, clenched like a blade. Ruth and Sarah spent the day hauling buckets from the stream and hammering up the last roof slats, even as wind bit through their coats. As the sun slid low, she lit every lamp in the cabin. Not for light, but for defiance. Night came heavy and silent. She barely slept. A coyote howled in the distance. Then a crack. Not thunder, not firewood. Glass. Ruth leapt from bed. One of the front windows had shattered inward. A rock lay on the floor with a piece of paper tied around it. She unwrapped it with shaking fingers. "You've been warned." Her breath caught. She stepped outside barefoot, the cold biting into her toes, and stared into the darkness, heart hammering against her ribs. No shadows moved, but she knew. They were watching. They weren't trying to scare her away from the land. They were trying to bury her inside it. She was trying to build a home, and they were already digging its grave. She shut the door, slowly bolted it, and knelt by the hearth, where Sarah stirred in her sleep. Ruth added another log, keeping the flame alive, refusing to be extinguished. By morning, she had a new plan, and it wouldn't involve waiting. The sun rose over frost-bitten fields, and a woman who had no more patience left to spare. Sometimes the loudest kind of justice is a woman who refuses to run. Ruth stood barefoot in the kitchen boots by the hearth, but not yet on her feet. Her hands moved with the steadiness of habit, slicing through bread that was more crust than softness, scooping coffee grounds into the pot, striking a match against the iron stove wall. Her eyes, though, those didn't move. They were fixed on the broken window, now boarded with scrap wood. Light crept through the edges like something too polite to enter. Sarah stirred in the corner, murmuring in her sleep. Ruth turned, poured water, poured silence, poured steel into her bones. Today she'd bury fear in the cold ground and plant resolve in its place. When Matthew returned mid-morning, his coat dusted with snow and his face dark with thought, he stepped into a house already pulsing with tension. "I got to Eli," he said, shrugging off his coat. "He'll help. He's got eyes like a hawk and 3 rifles that haven't seen rust. That's not all we'll need." He nodded. "I know. They're playing slow and mean, waiting until we flinch. I won't flinch." He looked at her then, like he was seeing something different in her, maybe something he used to have, and had buried too deep for spring to reach. "They want us to run," she said. "They want this place empty so no one sees what they'll do to the land, or to the ones who stay." Ruth opened the lockbox and laid the deed flat on the table between them. "Then we make them see us. Loud, clear, alive." They rode into town before noon, Ruth, Matthew, and Sarah bundled tight between them. The town of Marrow's Bend wasn't much more than a dirt crossroad with a general store, 1-room schoolhouse, and a faded church that leaned like it was ashamed. But people still gathered there. They watched when someone came in bloodied from a fight, or when the bank closed early with no reason. And now they watched as Ruth Vance strode straight into the sheriff's office, a deed in her gloved hand and fire under her ribs. Sheriff Boyle looked up from a lukewarm cup of coffee mustache, trembling with the effort of chewing tobacco and boredom. "Mrs. Vance," he said, sitting straighter. "I'm not here to exchange pleasantries," she said. "I'm here to report a threat to my property and my life." The sheriff blinked. "Men from Hastings Timber came to our cabin, not to talk, to intimidate. I want it on the record that we have legal ownership of the land and that we've been harassed. The coop was raided, a window smashed, and they left this." She dropped the note on his desk like it carried weight beyond ink. The sheriff cleared his throat, glancing to the deputy, who leaned too hard on the back wall. "Well, Mrs. Vance, the timber company's got legal rights too, not to our land." He shifted. "Look, I understand this is personal, but it's a big operation. There's jobs tied up in that mill." Matthew stepped forward, voice even but edged. "That doesn't give them license to trespass or threaten." The sheriff looked at Ruth again. "You sure you don't want to reconsider a sale? Folks in town say they're offering good money." "I don't want their money. I want peace. But I'll take justice if peace is off the table." The silence in the room changed, grew heavier. "I'll file the report," the sheriff muttered. "That's not all," Ruth said. "I'm holding a meeting. Here, 2 days from now. Right in front of the general store. I want everyone to hear what's happening. I want them to see our deed. I want them to know what this company's been doing to people up in the hills." Boyle paled. "You trying to start something? I'm trying to end it, before they torch another home." Word spread faster than frost in the valley. By dusk, Ruth had made flyers. Matthew nailed them to posts. Sarah handed them to shopkeepers who looked at her like she was handing out scripture. Eli arrived that evening with his rifles wrapped in burlap and a sack of beans slung over his back. "I like your backbone, girl," he told Ruth. "Reminds me of your father-in-law. They're not going to scare us out." "No. But they're counting on the others being too scared to stand with you." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Then we give them someone to follow." 2 nights passed. Then came the third. Cold. Still. Heavy with waiting. Ruth rose early, dressed with care. Her hair pulled back, her hands calloused but clean. She kissed Sarah's forehead and stepped out into the pale morning light. They rode in a wagon borrowed from Eli. On the side, in faded paint, was the name of the family who once farmed the upper ridge, now gone, their fields overrun with stumps. Ruth stood in front of the general store just as the town clock struck 11. At first, only a few folks came: Doc Henry, who lost his cousin's orchard to a mysterious blaze. Then Lena Mott, whose fence line had been moved 3 times in as many weeks. Then more shopkeepers, school teachers, mothers with arms folded tight. Matthew handed her the deed. Ruth held it up. "This is ours," she said, voice clear as ice water. "Not bought, not stolen, ours." She told them about the visits, the threats, the shattered glass, the chickens. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. But her words struck like hammer blows on cold iron. They're counting on silence, counting on fear, counting on us to disappear one by one. But I'm still here. Someone in the back muttered, "Amen." She held up the note, the threat scrawled across it in cruel block letters. "This is what they do when you don't say yes. So I'm saying no. Loud enough for all of you to hear. Loud enough for them." Crocker appeared, then stepping out of the saloon like a man summoned by name. He walked toward her, slow, eyes cold. "You making a scene, Mrs. Vance? I'm making history." The townsfolk shifted, but no one backed away. Crocker looked around. "You think this crowd can stop what's coming?" Ruth didn't flinch. "I think truth can, and I think you're more afraid of that than anything." Crocker sneered. "We'll see." He turned and left, but Ruth didn't miss the way his jaw had clenched, or the way his steps faltered. By sundown, something had changed in town. Folks tipped their hats to her. Lena brought her cornbread. Doc offered to check Sarah's cough. The noose of fear was loosening, but Ruth knew better than to relax. The wolves didn't retreat because you shouted. They retreated because they were planning to bite somewhere else. So that night, she bolted the windows twice, laid the rifle by the door, and whispered to the flame in the hearth, "They heard me today." But in her gut, she knew they weren't done. Because sometimes the loudest kind of justice is a woman who refuses to run. A house is just wood and stone until someone dares to fight for the life inside it. The wind groaned low across Iron Creek Ridge that morning, as if the land itself was bracing. A quiet that wasn't peace settled over the homestead. Ruth could feel it in her shoulders, in the way even the animals moved cautiously. The sky was that pale kind of gray that meant snow by evening. Matthew split wood beside the porch, his axe rising and falling in rhythm. Ruth sat near the window with Sarah curled in her lap, brushing through the girl's thick hair with steady hands. Each stroke was slow, firm, like she was untangling the fear that had built up since the last time Crocker darkened their road. They hadn't seen him since the town gathering, but Ruth knew that kind of silence. It wasn't retreat. It was coiling. Eli came up the path near noon, his face drawn tighter than usual. "They're planning something," he said without pleasantry. "Heard it from Martin down at the grain depot. Crocker and 2 of his boys bought dynamite from that traveling rail crew." Ruth's hand stopped mid-stroke in Sarah's hair. "Dynamite?" Matthew stepped forward, wiping sweat from his brow. "What for?" "Not for mining, that's certain. Word is they're going to make an example out of somebody. Soon." "They're coming here," Ruth said flatly. Matthew opened his mouth, but Ruth stood, gently setting Sarah down. "I won't wait for them to decide when. We decide. Today." They spent the next hours preparing, not in a frenzy, but with grim purpose. Ruth gathered what food they could store in the storm cellar. Matthew reinforced the front door. Eli patrolled the tree line with his rifle slung and his eyes sharp as flint. Even Sarah, small as she was, helped pack a satchel with water and matches. They didn't talk much. Words felt too thin for what was coming. As dusk slid down the hills like cold molasses, Ruth stood alone on the porch, the wind pushing at her shawl, her gaze fixed on the tree line. She could smell it in the air, smoke faint and sour. She turned inside. They're near. Matthew lit the lanterns one by one and moved Sarah into the cellar. Ruth crouched beside her, touched her cheek. You stay quiet, no matter what. Don't come out until I call. Sarah clung to her for a moment, eyes wide but dry. Will you come back? I will. Ruth touched her forehead. Because I have to. They sealed the hatch. The house grew still. Then the sound came, hooves pounding like war drums, closer and closer, until it felt like the land shook beneath them. Ruth stood near the door with the shotgun in her grip, Matthew beside her with the hunting rifle. Fronts too exposed, he murmured. We fall back, use the walls to our advantage. Ruth nodded, but her heart was beating so fast it rattled her bones. The first rock hit the window. Then a voice called out, Crocker. Last chance, Vance. This land ain't yours anymore. Walk away, and maybe you don't get hurt. Ruth opened the door. Just enough for her voice to carry. This land belongs to those who care for it. You don't want it. You want what's underneath. Silence followed. Then a laugh. You think your courage means anything? We've done worse for less. Then you'd best be ready for what's coming back at you. They came at once, two men, first shadows breaking from the trees, torches in hand. Ruth raised her gun. The first fell with a shout. The second dropped the torch, but kept running. Matthew fired from the side window, scattering them like crows. A crack split the air, dynamite thrown too soon. It exploded against the shed, shaking the ground but sparing the house. Ruth stepped out into the open, teeth-clenched, heart thunderous. Crocker emerged from the smoke, his coat flapping, pistol drawn. He didn't expect her. Didn't expect the woman he'd mocked in town to be walking toward him with her jaw set like iron. You should have run, he snarled. Ruth didn't blink. You should have known better. He raised the pistol. But Ruth had already fired. He staggered back, hit in the shoulder, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. Matthew tackled him before he could raise the gun again, driving him into the dirt, fists landing with years of fury behind them. The others scattered. Eli emerged from the tree-line, rifle aimed, yelling for them to drop their weapons. When the dust settled, 3 men lay bound by the coop. Crocker groaned through clenched teeth. The others were long gone, their courage leaking out with the last of the light. The fire had reached the edge of the barn, but Ruth and Eli smothered it with buckets of snow. By the time the sheriff arrived, the sun was gone and the stars had come out. He climbed from his horse and surveyed the scene, eyes resting longest on Ruth. You shot him? Yes. You afraid of the law coming down on you for that? No, she said simply, because he came to destroy what I built, and I won't apologize for protecting it. Boyle looked at Crocker, then back at her. Well, he said finally, I reckon a man with dynamite and no permit did more than enough to earn that. He pulled a scrap of paper from his coat. This is for you. She unfolded it. It was a notice of investigation into Hastings Timber Company. Enough town complaints had reached the state office. The land grabs, the threats, the arson. About time, Matthew muttered. Ruth folded the paper and tucked it into her coat. They thought this place was easy pickings. They thought a woman with a child would fold. The sheriff nodded slowly. Seems they thought wrong. After they left, Ruth walked back into the house. The air inside smelled of smoke and metal and something sacred like survival. She lifted the cellar door. Sarah blinked up at her. It's over for now. The child threw her arms around Ruth's neck, and Ruth sank to her knees, letting the weight of the night fall from her shoulders. The wind still blew outside, but it sounded different now. Less like a threat, more like breath, because a house is just wood and stone until someone dares to fight for the life inside it. Some roots are too deep for fire to burn. We didn't just survive, we belonged. The sun returned slowly in the days after the standoff, like it wasn't sure if it was welcome yet. Snow lingered on the ground, but the hard fear in people's faces had begun to thaw. Word spread fast across Iron Creek Ridge. Folks who hadn't visited the Vance place in years suddenly found themselves arriving with baskets, tools, and awkward offerings of help. A man named Whitlow brought fresh lumber for the shed, saying nothing, just nodding once at Ruth and setting the planks down beside the splintered wreckage. Mabel Tompkins arrived with canned peaches and a loaf of cornbread that still steamed her hands, trembling as she passed it to Ruth like a peace offering. Matthew built, repaired, and sawed from sunup to sundown, his shoulders looser now, not from rest, but from the quiet pride of purpose. Eli stayed close, keeping watch in his quiet way. But Ruth noticed he'd begun planting things too, onions, beans, rows of carrots. Like he believed there'd be a harvest worth protecting. Inside the house, Ruth worked beside Sarah and Boone, scrubbing soot from the walls and baking bread with cinnamon from the precious jar she'd hidden behind the flour sack. Boone followed her like a little barn cat, his wide eyes always watching, learning how the world moved when it wasn't trying to crush him. Sarah, steady and sharp, helped him pronounce letters with her finger pressed beneath each word of the newspaper. Sometimes they'd sit in the doorway and read aloud the town headlines, soft, slow syllables turning paper into possibility. The quiet of survival turned into the rhythm of rebuilding. But Ruth knew it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. The sheriff's letter was a start. But Crocker was just a branch. What lay beneath him was a root system thick with rot. Hastings' timber had stolen more than land. It had warped the way people saw each other, who they feared, who they trusted. "I want the records," Ruth told Eli one morning, her sleeves rolled up and her boots wet from snowmelt. He looked at her sideways. "You mean they're ledgers, I mean proof. Of every lie, every parcel they snatched from widows, drunkards, and desperate folks who couldn't read fine print. I want the names." Eli leaned against the porch post. "You planning to take down a company with paper and memory? I'm planning to remind this town what truth looks like." So they went to town again, not in fear, but in firm-footed purpose. Ruth wore her best dress beneath her coat, the one with the faded blue flowers that reminded her of her mother. Sarah and Boone stayed with Mabel, and Ruth kissed both their heads before leaving. "We're not done fighting," she whispered, "but now it's for more than just us." They walked into town, shoulders squared, eyes forward. People parted like water, some out of shame, others in respect. Nobody sneered anymore. At the county registrar's office, Ruth met a man named Granger, an old clerk who remembered too much and spoke too little. She sat across from him in the stale back room that smelled like ink and damp carpet, her hands folded, gaze steady. "I know they've used you," she said, "and I know you kept records anyway." He didn't blink. "But I also believe," she continued, "that someone like you writes things down because truth matters, even if it's buried." Granger reached beneath the desk and pulled out a battered folio. "Don't take it from here," he said gruffly, "but you can copy it." Ruth opened it slowly. Inside were pages of transactions, timber deeds signed with X's by men too drunk to stand, or by widows who thought they were trading taxes for time. The same notary initials. The same 3 Hastings field agents. A clear trail of theft, legal, but only in the barest technical sense. She copied until her fingers cramped, Eli holding the paper still in the lamplight. When they left, the wind was colder, but Ruth felt warmer than she had in months. They presented the copies to the sheriff first. Boyle squinted at them, jaw tight. This'll take time. We've lived in time. We'll keep doing that, Ruth replied. But I want the public to see what's been done. She didn't wait for the sheriff to decide. Ruth posted copies in the church hall on the bulletin board at Wilkins's store, even nailed one to the steps of the town meeting house. It wasn't anger that stirred in people's eyes when they read it was recognition. The names listed belonged to neighbors, friends. The damage wasn't distant. It was theirs. Soon the letters started. Handwritten, shaky, some just a few lines. I thought I was the only one. He told me I owed him interest, but I never took a loan. They came while I was burying my wife and said I missed a deadline I never saw. Eli helped organize them. Ruth stitched them into folders. When the state investigator finally arrived, she handed them over with the kind of calm that only comes from long-earned truth. Your company sold off half of Iron Creek and called it charity, she said. Now we're calling it theft. The investigator raised an eyebrow. You were just a name in a complaint 6 weeks ago, and now I'm the name they know. The Hastings office shuttered 2 months later. Quietly, no announcements. Just locks changed and wagons leaving before dawn. But the land didn't forget. Trees still bore the scars of overcutting. Fields still healed slowly. But people changed. Old fences were repaired, not just wood and wire, but neighbor to neighbor. Families that hadn't spoken in years sat on front porches, passed pie plates, and asked about each other's health. The Vance house, once a target, became something of a symbol. Ruth didn't want that. She just wanted peace. One evening, Sarah tugged at Ruth's skirt while she kneaded bread. What are we now? The girl asked. Ruth looked down, her hands dusted in flour. We're what fire couldn't take. She brushed Sarah's cheek with the back of her hand and smiled. Because some roots are too deep for fire to burn. We didn't just survive, we belonged. You didn't save me out of pity, I whispered. You did it because somewhere in you knew I belonged here. It was a cold morning when I rose, early dusted flour across the worn pine counter, and began kneading the dough. The kitchen smelled of yeast and wood smoke, a comfort that had settled into my bones. Caleb's boots thudded across the porch outside, and I could hear him tending to the horses, whistling low. I listened to that sound, the way I might listen to rain falling on a roof, rhythmic anchoring proof of life moving forward. Elijah was still asleep upstairs, bundled into quilts Ruthie had stitched decades ago, and Ruthie herself sat quietly by the fire, her knitting needles clinking in soft rhythm. She hadn't said much since the visit from the sheriff 2 days earlier, but her silence wasn't cold. It was thoughtful, reverent, even as if she was watching the pieces of the past settle into place. I knew she remembered the man who'd tried to buy us. The scar on her wrist from years ago when she'd fought off a gambler trying to take her land had flared red when she saw him. She hadn't spoken his name, but she didn't have to. We all understood that kind of evil wears different faces in different times. That morning, as the sky lightened, Caleb came in, his hair wind-tossed and his coat smelling of hay and frost. He held a stack of letters tied with a red string. These came through town, he said, laying them on the table. Mostly bills, but one's for you. I wiped flour from my hands and took the envelope. My name was written in a delicate, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a small folded letter. I read it slowly, my eyes tracing every word like a prayer. It was from a teacher in Eliah's old town. She had heard from someone at the station what had happened. She wrote about how Eliah used to sit quietly at the back of the classroom, never speaking unless called on, how he'd flinch at sudden noises, but how he'd once spent all afternoon drawing a picture of a house with a wraparound porch and someone playing guitar on the steps. She said she always hoped he'd find that place. I folded the letter and held it against my chest. He had dreamed this. Long before the train ride, before the snow, before Caleb, my brother, had dreamed us here. Later that afternoon, after chores and before supper, I sat on the back steps, watching the sun lean low toward the hills. Caleb came out with 2 tin mugs of coffee, handed me one, and sat beside me. "Quiet today," he said. "I've been thinking," I said, "about how everything used to feel like a cliff, like at any moment we'd fall off the edge again." His jaw tightened, and he nodded, eyes fixed on the fence line. "But now," I went on, "it's not like that. I don't wake up waiting for something awful to happen. You shouldn't have had to live that way." I looked at him then. The evening light softened the lines of his face. "You didn't save me out of pity," I whispered. "You did it because somewhere in you, you knew I belonged here." His hand brushed against mine, not quite holding it, just close enough for the warmth to pass between us. "I didn't know much," he said, "but I knew enough to recognize a soul trying to survive." I took a breath. "I still feel that girl sometimes. The one on the auction block. The one no one looked at." "I saw you," he said. "Not just then. I saw who you could be." Inside the house, Eliah's laugh rang out. He was playing checkers with Ruthie, and she was letting him win. Or maybe he was truly beating her. He'd gotten sharp quick to read patterns, clever with his hands. I smiled. "He's happier now. Because of you. Because of all of us," I said. "You gave us a place. A name. That's more than most folks ever get." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Like the hush in a chapel when sunlight filters through stained glass, and everything feels wrapped in a higher meaning. That evening, as the stars dusted the sky, I went to tuck Eliah in. He was already half asleep, his face buried in the crook of a flannel pillow. "Do you like it here?" I asked softly, brushing a hand through his hair. He nodded without opening his eyes. "It's warm here. I like the horse. And Ruthie sings when I'm scared." I kissed his forehead. "You're safe, little brother. Nobody's going to hurt you again." He mumbled something I didn't catch, already slipping into dreams. Back downstairs, Ruthie had left a pie on the windowsill, apple dusted with sugar and cinnamon. Caleb leaned against the doorway. "Sometimes," he said, "I don't know how I ever lived before y'all came." I turned from the pie to face him. "Maybe you were waiting too. Just didn't know it." He stepped closer. "I've had this house so long, but it never felt like home until your boots landed on the porch." The weight of his words hung there, gentle and sure. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass that lined the property. I wrapped my arms around myself, not out of cold, but from the sudden realization that this life, this warm, wild, fragile life, was ours to claim. "There's something I want to do," I said. Caleb raised a brow. "I want to change our names. Legally. For Eliah. For me. I want a name that belongs to this land. To this family." He took that in quietly, then nodded. "We'll ride into town first thing. I'll stand with you when you do it." The warmth that spread in my chest was unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't just love. It was grounding. It was legacy. Later that night, as I stood at the window watching the stars blink above the barn, I thought of all the things that had broken me. Hunger, cold, that auction. But none of them had the last word. What had the last word was choice. And I had chosen to stay, to believe, to belong. The wind howled outside, but inside the house we were a new kind of unshakable. The lanterns in the hallway flickered low as Mary Ellen stood outside the parlor, pressing a folded letter between her palms. Her fingers were trembling again, not from fear, but from fury, and something that tasted like purpose. The rich red rug muffled her steps as she entered, eyes settling on Mr. Garrick, seated in the same high-backed leather chair where he had first looked down his nose at her. "You've read the letter," he said. Without looking up from the glass of amber liquor he swirled lazily in his hand. Mary Ellen held it tighter. "I've memorized it. You're smarter than you look." She ignored the bait. "It's a lie. And it's not legal." "Oh, it's legal," he replied coolly. "I had it drawn up months ago. When I saw how easily you took to that house, I figured you'd try to burrow your way in." Her breath caught. "So you plan to take everything I own, the land. I financed the improvements. Even the boys' schooling came from my accounts. I owed your husband nothing. And you even less." He finally met her eyes, expression smug, as if the ink on his betrayal had already dried. But Mary Ellen didn't flinch. "You used that land as leverage to buy a name to look good to the neighbors. You put your stamp on it, then waited until we worked it into something beautiful before snatching it back." "You think I care what's beautiful?" Garrick said, rising to refill his glass. "I care what's profitable. And what about honor?" He laughed. "Honor is for men who can't afford lawyers." Mary Ellen moved closer. The fire crackled behind him, shadows playing across his features like they were deciding whether to cast him as man or monster. She lowered her voice. "My late husband signed a deed with your name beside his. But that paper was temporary. There's a second copy, one you don't know about." He paused mid-pour. "That's a lie. It's not. And I'll find it." A pause stretched too long. Then coldly he replied, "Even if you did what court would hear your case, you're a widow with no name, no clout. And I own the judge's winter house." Mary Ellen took a slow breath. "Then I'll build a bigger court, one that doesn't need marble pillars or robes. I'll tell the neighbors, the town, your business partners. I'll tell the church elders, the school board, the papers. You wouldn't. I already started." The color drained from Garrick's face. His voice dropped and octave teeth clenched. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, turning for the door. "You will?" Outside in the hallway, Ruth was waiting, her face pale but steady. "Did he believe you?" Ruth whispered. "I don't care," Mary Ellen answered, "because it's going to be true." They left the house in silence, the night air wrapping around them like a shiver of justice. By dawn, word had begun to ripple through Iron Creek. Mary Ellen stood in front of the general store basket on her arm, while townsfolk eyed her with sidelong glances. But she didn't shrink from them. She greeted them each by name, asked after their families, offered help with lifting parcels or delivering bread. Inside, she saw Sheriff Thomason rifling through the newspaper rack. He looked up and gave a cautious nod. "Miss Mary Ellen." "Sheriff." "I heard some things. I imagine you did." He scratched the back of his neck. "Hard to know what's true and what's bitterness. You know me, Sheriff. You've watched me carry this town's water. Seen me stretch $1, fix a roof, teach a boy to read when no one else would. Do I strike you as bitter?" "No," he admitted. "You strike me as a woman who's finally tired of swallowing what don't sit right. That's about it." The sheriff looked like he was weighing something heavier than a badge. "You planning to fight him in court?" "No." He raised a brow. "I'm going to make it, so that court's the least of his problems." Back at the house, Mary Ellen and Ruth pulled out every drawer, every ledger, every envelope pressed between boards. They searched for hours, then days, tracking old deeds and forgotten corners of legal language her husband had scrawled in tiny ink across the margins. On the fourth evening, as the last rays of sun slanted across the old barn, Ruth ran in, waving a dusty envelope. Found something. Inside was a duplicate of the deed, one that clearly named Samuel as sole heir, with Mary Ellen listed as successor in case of death. And there, in faded blue ink, was Mr. Garrick's signature below a clause he'd clearly missed, that after a certain number of years, all rights reverted to the builder of the home, unless formal buyout was filed. He didn't file, Ruth whispered. No, Mary Ellen said softly. He got greedy. She carried the document to the porch and sat down, letting the dusk settle over her shoulders like a shawl. It was proof, not just of land or home, but of the fact that what she'd built, what her family had endured for, was real. And not even a man with Garrick's money could take that truth from her. The following Sunday, Mary Ellen and Ruth arrived at church with Caleb between them. People whispered as they stepped down the aisle, but she held her head high. After the sermon, Mr. Garrick stood near the chapel entrance, shaking hands like nothing had changed. Mary Ellen walked straight toward him, pulling the deed from her coat pocket and holding it between them. He froze. She leaned in, voice low. This is now in the hands of Pastor Haynes, and his wife, and the school teacher, and the store clerk, and a lawyer in Cheyenne who owes my late husband a favor. Garrick's fingers twitched. If you try anything else, this town will know exactly who you are. His smile faltered. She gave a slight nod. You should pray about that. With that, she turned and walked away past the pews, past the whispers toward the light spilling through the chapel doors. Ruth followed, and Caleb clutched her hand, like he'd known all along this day would come. As they stepped into the sunlight, Ruth asked, "What now?" Mary Ellen's eyes drifted toward the road leading west, voice firm. Now we finish what we started. The educational lesson learned from this story is that standing up to those who manipulate power for their own gain often starts with small acts of courage. Even without money or title, a person's integrity, persistence, and community can become their strongest defense. When justice in courts feels out of reach, justice in hearts and homes can still prevail. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has nothing left to lose but their truth. You raised me to disappear, but I learned how to be seen. Rain fell steady over the valley, drumming soft against the porch roof, as if the land itself were remembering. Ruth sat on the swing with her hands folded tight in her lap, eyes locked on the mist curling over the fields. Jonah's coat hung beside hers, still damp from his early morning ride into town. He said he'd be back by supper, but it was nearing dusk. Beside her, a bundle of old photos rested in a tin box, things she'd gathered from the attic after Aunt Delia passed. A younger Ruth, wide-eyed in Sunday dresses. A boy who looked like Jonah, but wasn't. Her father's face stiff with pride, and her mother still smiling in those early years before she became the woman who taught silence with every look. Ruth held one picture longer than the rest. It was from her 7th birthday. She sat on the floor in a blue gingham dress, hands reaching toward a small cake. Her mother behind her, arms folded. No one else was in the frame, not even her father. He was likely at work or simply out of sight. That was the way it had always been. When Jonah returned, his boots muddy and his shoulders heavy with some unseen burden, Ruth didn't speak. She simply scooted over, and he sat. The silence stretched comfortably between them, a kind of language they'd both come to understand. "Got a telegram," he said at last. "From Baton Rouge." Ruth turned slow. "Is it her?" Jonah nodded. "Your mother. She's at some church shelter. Says she's sick, real sick. Asked for you." The wind picked up across the field, tugging at the dry husks of corn left after harvest. Ruth's jaw tensed. After all this time, she didn't say much. Just your name. Said she didn't want to die without making it right. Ruth looked back out over the field. Her chest felt tight, not with grief, but something heavier. Something like fury gone cold. She made sure I had nothing. Said I wasn't family. Called me cursed. Let that man tear me down in her name. I know, Jonah said, but I also know how it eats a person carrying unfinished things. Ruth exhaled through her nose. She didn't think about that when she finished me off. Jonah reached for her hand, rough thumb brushing her knuckles. Maybe you go not for her, but for yourself. Ain't about forgiving. Just about looking her in the eye. Being seen. Ruth didn't answer. She just sat in the fading light, listening to the wind roll in like a tide. That night, she dreamt of pine needles and burning letters. And in the morning, she packed a small bag. The road to Baton Rouge was long lined with sycamores and memories. Each town they passed carried some echo of her past. An old shop sign, the outline of a house that used to stand the scent of something burning in the distance that reminded her of her father's old wood stove. They found the church on the edge of town. White paint peeling from the walls, the steeple leaning like a weary soldier. Inside, a woman named Sister Eliza led them to a quiet room, its windows cracked open to let in the breeze. She's weak, the sister warned. But she's been waiting for you, Miss Ruth. Ruth stepped inside alone. Her mother was thinner than she remembered. The sharp lines in her face had turned into hollows. The woman who once stood rigid with pride now lay curled beneath a crocheted quilt skin, gray with time and guilt. Mama. The old woman's stirred eyes fluttering open. For a long moment she stared uncertain. Then a flicker of something passed over her face. You came, she rasped. I almost didn't. I figured, her mother said, voice like dry leaves. Figured I'd earned that. Ruth stood stiff at the foot of the bed. Why now I got nothing left to lose, her mother whispered. Cancer's eaten through the rest. But I remembered. Your eyes. The only thing of mine that didn't turn bitter. Ruth sat in the corner chair. She didn't speak. Her mother blinked at the ceiling. I was cruel. I know that now. Always thought silence was strength. Thought pushing you out was protecting myself. But all I did was rot everything close to me. Ruth clenched her jaw. You taught me to vanish, to make myself smaller just to stay in the room. I know, her mother breathed. I taught you to disappear, but maybe you found a way to be seen anyhow. Silence again, the kind that begged to be broken. I'm not here to forgive, Ruth said. I'm not even sure I know how. I ain't asking for that, her mother said. Just wanted you to see me, weak, alone. Nothing but bones and regret. Ruth rose and walked to the window. The street below was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a bell rang the hour. You ever think of Daddy? Ruth asked without turning. Her mother coughed. He left long before he died, was never really here, and yet you stood by him. Let him tear me apart. I was afraid. Thought men like him ruled the world. Didn't think a girl like you would survive without obeying. Ruth turned, then her voice calm. Well, I did. And I didn't just survive, I rebuilt. Her mother's eyes glistened. That's what I hoped, even when I pretended I didn't care. Ruth looked down at her hands. You can't fix this with words. Not now. I know. But I will say this, Ruth added, breath steady. I'll carry your name, but I won't carry your silence. The old woman nodded slowly, eyes drifting shut again. When Ruth walked out of the room, Jonah stood waiting in the hallway, hat in hand. You all right? No, Ruth said. But I'm not broken either. They walked out into the dusk together, the sky painted soft with lavender and bruised gold. Behind them, the church bell rang once, then twice. In the hotel room that night, Ruth sat by the window, journal open in her lap. She wrote not to her mother, but to herself. She wrote about the weight of memory and the price of silence, and the freedom of facing ghosts without flinching. Jonah brought her tea, set it quietly beside her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For reminding me that seeing the truth even when it hurts is better than living blind." He gave her a small smile. "Reckon the truth's the only thing that sets us free." Ruth looked out over the town. Street lamps flickered one by one, and somewhere in her chest, something long buried unknotted itself. She didn't forgive, but she saw. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning, of course. The frost came heavy that morning, blanketing the ranch in a quiet white hush. No birds, no cattle lowing, just silence and the sharp crack of ice under boots. Ruth stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. Across the yard, Boone was hitching the wagon, his breath fogging in the bitter air. Behind her, the cabin stirred softly, warm with coffee, with little Caleb rolling his tin cup along the floor, giggling every time it clinked against the hearth. But Ruth didn't smile. She hadn't told Boone yet. She couldn't. In her hand, the letter felt like a coal, still glowing, burned at the edges from rereading, but never truly cold. Inside was an invitation, though it felt more like a threat. Eliza Worthington was coming to Iron Creek. Not just visiting, coming with a team of investors to assess potential growth opportunities across Western Holdings. Boone's land, Ruth's refuge, their quiet life. It was all wrapped up in that polite, stiffly worded note. And at the bottom, scrawled in the handwriting Ruth knew too well, "Be a dear and make this easy for me. You still owe me a favor, darling." She felt it like a slap. The favor, the old debt she'd foolishly promised in a moment of desperation before she'd ever seen Boone's eyes go soft around Caleb, before she'd understood what home felt like. She heard his boots on the porch. She tucked the letter behind her back. "You all right?" Boone asked. His brow creased under his hat. "You been out here a while?" Ruth nodded quickly, too quickly. "Just thinking. It's real cold." "You ain't got to worry about the weather," he said gently. "You got me now. And I got you." She could have broken right then. That voice, low, warm, steady as river rock. He meant every word, and she was holding a secret like a rattlesnake in her hands. Inside the cabin, Ada was pulling on her boots, ready to help pack supplies for the schoolhouse. Ruth went in and busied herself with sandwiches, fingers trembling slightly as she folded the wax paper. Boone watched her a long moment, then stepped out into the snow. They rode into town together later that morning, Ada in the front, with Ruth Caleb bundled in the back under quilts. The trail was slick, and the mountains loomed wide and silver. Ruth barely saw them. They stopped by the mercantile for flour and lamp oil. Boone went in, and Ruth lingered beside the wagon. Across the street, the new hotel gleamed like a fresh scar, built with money Eliza had likely helped raise. It was already drawing attention. There'd be talk, there'd be questions, and if Eliza got what she wanted, there'd be a sale. Ruth wasn't sure Boone even knew the land had oil rights buried in the deed. He never asked about such things. He didn't measure life in shares and assets. He measured it in hands held in fence posts, mended in dinners around the table. She remembered what Eliza had once whispered behind a curtain at a New York gala, a crystal glass in her hand. "You'll never belong with those people. You're too smart, too sharp. You'll slit your own throat on all that virtue." She'd believed her once, but not anymore. Still, the fear gnawed at her. Because the truth was, Eliza didn't bluff. And if Ruth didn't help, Eliza could dig, could talk, could twist things until even Boone began to doubt who Ruth was. "You all right?" Ada asked, her dark eyes soft as she slid out of the wagon. "Just cold," Ruth lied again. They rode home with silence growing between her and Boone like a chasm. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire until it burned low, the letter open again in her lap. The last line haunted her. I'll expect your cooperation. I know what's at stake. She wasn't sure what Eliza knew, but it wouldn't take much to destroy this peace they'd all built. A few whispered half-truths, a bit of legal pressure, maybe even custody papers that questioned her guardianship of Caleb. Boone stirred in the bed behind her. You ain't coming to bed, he asked groggily. She folded the letter in her lap. In a minute. You ain't slept much. She said nothing. Boone sat up slowly, his voice low. Ruth, don't do that. Do what carry weight without telling me it's heavy. Her breath caught. I see it all over you, he said. That faraway look. Like the wolves are coming. You don't gotta fight alone anymore. Her hands curled tight. Boone, what if I did something once? Something I'm ashamed of. He didn't speak. She stared into the fire. Back east, I made a deal. With a woman who helped get Caleb and me on a train. I thought I owed her, but now she's coming here. She wants something. I don't know what she'll say or do. Boone stood and crossed the room, sat beside her on the floor. You think that'd change how I see you? I'm not who I said I was. I never asked you to be anyone but the woman who knelt down in the snow and picked up that child like he was her own blood. Her eyes burned. You saved my boy. You saved me. You think I'm letting go of that 'cause someone from your past wants to stir up dust. She looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes didn't flinch. They held the truth steady. He reached over, took her hand, and pressed it to his chest. Whatever comes, we face it together. Long as you want to stand beside me. Tears spilled. She didn't hide them. I do, she whispered. I do. He pulled her close, and in the quiet that followed, Ruth felt something shift, not outside but inside her. A decision made not from fear but from love. She would face Eliza, but not as a pawn, as a woman who'd built a family. One she'd protect. The quote of the chapter echoed in her soul like a vow forged in fire. You ain't gotta fight alone anymore. And she believed it. For the first time in her life, she believed it. The educational lesson learned from this story is that dignity often begins the moment a person decides they are worth protecting, even when the world has taught them otherwise. Life may take away home's names or security, but it cannot take the strength built through honest work, perseverance, and standing by those we love. For many, real family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we choose and fight to keep. And sometimes the greatest peace comes not from winning every battle, but from knowing we no longer face them alone.